In this episode of the Project Management Podcast, we discover the best tools for your PMO.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com. This is episode number 420. It's a premium episode and I'm Cornelius Fichtner. Premium means that it is reserved for you, our premium subscribers. Thank you for joining us and for supporting the podcast. If you are setting up a PMO for your company, then no matter what industry you are in, having the right PMO tools at our disposal can make a significant difference. And as they relate to PMOs, tools are the moment when you shift your focus from management to administration. In fact, we project managers and program managers may even find ourselves scrambling around to find not only relevant but also accurate information to update our statuses, while resource managers may have to connect with several people to determine if they have efficiently staffed their resources and have sufficient capacity for the upcoming initiatives. And these are just some of the reasons why our PMOs need the right tools. But what are the right tools and how do we identify them? And why on earth did we end up using this tool over here, which is clearly wrong for our PMO? All of those questions and also why are the right tools so important is what we are going to discuss today with Hussein Bandukwala. Hello, Hussein, and welcome back to the Project Management Podcast.
Thanks, Cornelius. It's great to be back.
Before we get to the heart of the interview, let me start with this. Why are PMOs important?
That's such a great question, Cornelius. PMOs really help you get over from an environment of wild, wild west to a place where things are methodical, consistent, and predictable. And not every organization needs a PMO. Sometimes in organizations that are small, the PMO could often not be required. But as those organizations start seeing growth, that wild, wild west scenario starts turning into chaos instead of an enabler. It becomes an inhibitor. And that's where a PMO becomes so valuable. So making sure that, things are going consistently and predictably, that is key. Having good visibility into what everyone is doing, making sure that the right things are being done at the right time by the right people, that is important. Making sure that the workforce is efficient and happy, that is key. And all of this ultimately really boils down to what's the end goal? What are the benefits that the organization is really striving towards? What's the strategy is looking to achieve? That gets realized. And all in all, that effectively really leads to long-term, revenue or long-term cost savings. And that's where PMOs can really help. And that's why they're so important.
Thank you. And now let us turn to the main topic of our interview here today. You wrote and you delivered also a presentation titled Discovering the Best Tools for Your PMO. And we want to introduce our listeners to these best tools. So let's start at the beginning here. What exactly are PMO tools?
So PMO tools are any sort of tools that help support the function and management of a project management office and all that it does. So if I were to name a few things, Cornelius, PMO tools really help supporting the management of schedule, management of resources, of time, of project priority, of project financials, of risks and issues, of communication, and ultimately the benefits realization. So everything that a PMO does, if a tool is there to support it, it becomes a PMO tool. And then you see PMO tools in various shapes and sizes and functions. Some of these offer all of these different components and functionalities. Some of them offer a good variety and combination, and some specialize in just one of them. So all of these things, really define what a PMO tool really is.
Your presentation also speaks of enablers. What are enablers?
So PMO tools, Cornelius, don't live in silos. When you think of any tool, what really needs to happen? Well, to make a tool work, it needs to follow a process. That's enabler one. That's the blueprint of how a PMO tool will work, right? So for instance, if you have a schedule management tool, there's a certain process in which the schedule is created. And if it's done haphazardly, the tool is not going to function the way it was designed or required or expected to be. So therefore, having processes, the right processes in place is the blueprint, is the enabler for making sure that the PMO tools work properly. What else does a PMO tool, or any tools for that matter, work with? Well, data. That's really the fuel, right? Garbage in, garbage out, as we are all very familiar with. You put junk in, you'll get junk out. And so making sure that you have the right data in place is so critical. And that's enabler number two. And then finally, people. Those are people who are actually using the tool, making sure that not only is the tool used properly, but the effectiveness, the outputs of those tools are communicated and relayed properly as well, right? So you can have a novice driver drive a Ferrari, you'll still may go through a few bumps here and there. But if you have an expert driver and you're driving an economical car, you're going to get from point A to point B with no issues whatsoever. So having those peoples and making sure that they are armed and trained properly, those becomes enablers as well. So according to me, Cornelius, the three enablers for PMO tools are data, people, and processes.
And why are PMO tools and their enablers so important to PMOs?
In a nutshell, Cornelius, they help you get the job done with efficiency and accuracy. Without these enablers, your PMOs aren't going to function. Your PMO tools aren't going to function the way you expected them to be. The role of these tools is to make sure that they are supporting the PMO to know what's happening, right? So understand who's working on what things, understand how much time is being spent, understand how much cost has been spent, knowing that. And then number two, understanding and predicting what's going to be the outcome. So if you have a burn rate of the budget at a certain pace, at that same rate, or with that combined with the schedule ahead, what do you predict that to be, right? Or if you slipped at so many tasks so far, what is going to be the impact on the schedule? That predictability. And then using all of these things and collecting and informing this information to the relevant stakeholders and then enabling them to make a decision on what should happen next. The entire cycle of knowing, predicting, informing, and deciding, that is what PMO tools help the PMO do. Without the enablers, that's not going to happen. Without PMO tools, that's not going to happen.
Right. And just to be clear, we're not going to be talking about tools themselves much in our discussion here. We want to discover the best tools for our PMOs. That's the goal. And each PMO obviously needs different best tools, which indicates to me that there are also tools out there that do not meet the needs of my personal PMO. So what happens if we don't have the right tools for our PMO? And how do we even end up with tools that aren't right for us?
That's a great question, Cornelius. I think we talked a bit about what doesn't happen when you don't have the right tools, right? So essentially, everything that the PMO is supposed to do is supposed to help the organization with. That's not going to happen effectively and efficiently, and essentially is going to create more work. And so that is going to leave a bad taste in people's mouth for the PMO. Now, how do you get into a position where you end up with the wrong tools or not the best tools for your PMO? And I really categorize those reasons into two buckets. You either are not the right fit for the organization, the tool is not the right fit for the organization, or the enablers are dysfunctional. So let's quickly talk a bit about both of them, right? So how are you not the right fit for the organization? Well, because maybe sometimes somebody didn't do the due diligence in understanding what the right tool could be for the organization and when with the best tool. And let's say that best tool is extremely mature, it comes with a ton of documentation, ton of functionality, and there is just not enough appetite for someone in the organization to take all of that, lead through the implementation, get all the necessary integration done, train all the right people to do it, and then use it. Maybe all that functionality is not even needed, right? And on the flip side, sometimes people may go with the cheapest tool, and that too may not meet the needs sufficiently for the organization. In other situations, I can think of is, let's say there's a merger and acquisition that happens for an organization, and the organization that was merged in was used to a certain type of culture, was used to a certain type of tools, but then they were forced and pushed to use the tools that the organization that made the acquisition to use. And so in that situation, the tools that are being forced upon, that doesn't work. And you know what? Even outside of mergers and acquisitions, I have seen organizations, different geographies within different organization, push certain tools onto other regions and geographies, and that just doesn't fly. Those things are, people are either using them and they're not happy, or it's taking longer to get things done. But it's essentially boiling down to the fact that they're not the right fit for the organization. Looking quickly at the dysfunctional enablers, right? So we talked about three enablers: process, data, and people. When do processes become dysfunctional? Well, when they're complicated and it's just not something that can jive well within a specific tool, or it requires a ton of coordination and the organization just isn't ready for it, or the processes themselves aren't standardized or even documented. And when you go about setting up a tool or implementing a tool that's supposed to follow those processes, well, good luck with that, right? When you go with data, the fuel of the tools, this to me is so challenging, because many times you set up a tool, there are certain expectations, but the data may not even exist, or may be inaccurate, or it may take a lot of time to collect and prepare the right data, or it just may be spread across 5 different files, held by 20 different people, and it just may not be something that could be easily updated. So data, not having the right data and a good strategy where everything is central and easily updated and can be trusted, that is so key in making sure that the PMO tools are successful and that enabler works as functioned. And then finally, looking at the people, if they're not trained enough, or they don't have the right acumen or the maturity to accept a certain tool, or don't even support it because they don't like it and there's not enough incentives given for people to use, well, you know what, things are not going to get done with passion, with intensity, and as a result, the tool may take the blame for it, but instead it might be the people who should be taking the blame for it. So those are some of the reasons, Cornelius, why I think that how we fall into situations where we aren't blessed, I would say, with the best tools for the job.
The obvious next question is, of course, how do we then find the tools for our PMO that are actually right for us? What do we have to think about? How do we approach this?
So, in my opinion, Cornelius, I think that we need to focus on 4 key components and 4 key steps when you're talking about which PMO tools you need to do. You need to first understand what the requirements for the tools are, what does the end goal for the tool, and then once you've done that, you need to validate that those requirements are truly what you have thought or you have heard from others to be. Then you go about identifying the tools that will fit within those validated requirements, and then finally implementing and rolling out the tool.
How exactly do we do that? What do we have to look at? Let's go through these 4 components one by one that you mentioned. So component 1 was requirements identification, right?
Yes. So for requirements identification, you really need to understand what tools you have in place. And if you don't have any, then what are the needs of the organization for the specific tools? So for instance, I had a situation where there was a client where they were using one of the best or most mature tools in the market, I would say, only for tracking time. I mean, what kind of a waste is that, right? They did need something that was partially of what the tool was offering, but much more than what they were using it for currently. But it was a complete deep dive into what was available for the organization, what was needed, and what was the gap between those two and how you could fill through that. Just the way for any project, Cornelius, you have a set of requirements. This is exactly what you need to do for a new tool that you're going to get. Who is it going to be for? Why are they going to use it? What is it going to be used for? How often will they use it? What are the parameters that are required? What are the data points that are required? All those things need to be taken care of for that. So what really needs to happen is, again, you need to identify all the right stakeholders for this, speak with them, understand what the business capabilities are, what success really looks like for them when the tool is in place, and then have all the prioritized requirements collected together. And not only that, but with the requirements in place, once you know what the tool is like, what are some of the metrics that can be used to gauge that success as well? That is key for the first step, which is identifying the requirements.
Mm-hmm. Component 2 or step 2 was requirements validation. Am I assuming correctly that requirements validation and identification is not necessarily, you can't do one and then, wait until you do the other. So happens probably a bit hand in hand.
I would say that it can happen hand in hand, but my preference is that it doesn't. Because once you've identified all the requirements, then you want to go about proving that those indeed are the requirements. And so my suggestion is that you conduct a proof of concept and a pilot on those requirements. So the proof of concept is building a tool or getting a tool that will in large part meet the requirements that have already been identified. So for instance, if you have a resource management tool, for instance, you've identified all the things that the resource management tool needs to do. You can maybe create a tool in Excel to mimic that. You could perhaps get trial versions of tools that are available in the market and see what tools can do to meet your requirements. And then once you've determined what that proof of concept is, whether it's a trial version in the market, whether it's something that you've built from ground up, whether it's a custom developed proof of concept in-house, do a pilot on it. So run that through in real life scenarios, have real people take care of real issues in a small contained environment for a limited period of time, and see which of those requirements that you had collected in the first phase were actually getting met. Were there any other variations of those requirements that were being identified in the pilot? Were some of the requirements not needed at all? Those are some of the things that really the validation process takes care of, Cornelius. And I do believe that once you have all the requirements identified, can you then validate and or evolve from the requirements to confirm what you actually really need. So really the intent here with the validation is to have that proof of concept and build that pilot accordingly.
Right, but before you can build the pilot, component 3, step 3 comes into effect, and that is tool identification.
Yes. So the tool identification here, I would say there are two components here. There's the tool identification, and or also the vendor selection. Now, I have seen in most cases that whatever tool that was identified as part of the concept, that essentially does become the tool of choice. So whether that trial version that was used, and obviously an Excel version is something that's, or any other custom developed tool may or may not be used, but perhaps something suitable in the market or could be used as a parallel, or you could have your own in-house team take it from there and develop a full-fledged solution, if you will. The reason why I also say vendor selection here, Cornelius, is because sometimes organizations don't have the skill set to either build the tools in-house and or roll out the tools in-house, because both are critically important. When you're bringing in new tools, there's a lot of change involved. And so you may need, either external consultants for a temporary period to help roll that out, or you may need someone to help you build those tools as well. So really procuring or building that tool, that is key. Having the support, whether having internal support or external, once the tool is rolled out, that is important, right? And then the rolling out, whether it's internal or external, that is key as well. So that essentially tool identification here is really determining the tool, determining the vendors for not just building the tool if required, but also ongoing support and rollout as well.
In fact, you have component 4, the tool implementation, the rollout, as a separate step in your presentation. Is there anything specific that we have to think about here?
Yes. So the tool identification in step 3 was about identifying the tool, and in step 2 we talked about just the pilot, but now you have to roll it out to the entire organization or to a specific department and get all the functionality out as required. So really, we're just looking at projectizing this and rolling with it, right? So whether an organization wants to roll it out through a software development lifecycle or a project management lifecycle, have the relevant governance and change management aspect to it, have schedules, budgets, etc., and a full team to roll this out. That is something that the step 4, which is the tool implementation, is all about. So at the end of that project, you have your tool, you have all the enablers in place, which is the right processes, you have the data, so the whole data gathering, evaluation, implementation strategy, and obviously the change management and the knowledge management and training of the people. That all comes within the implementation of the tool as well.
I know that you have seen this approach applied to real-life PMOs. Can you maybe describe to us what the PMO was like before and after this discovery and rolling out of the right PMO tools?
Absolutely. So, this sort of goes back to the statement that I made a bit earlier about a client using a state-of-the-art tool, using just it for time management functionality. What it really needed to do was take that specific tool and carve out an entire resource management strategy for it. So that organization's PMO had no idea about who was working on what was the skill sets for everyone, what was the availability for everyone. Do they need to hire for more resources based on the intake of projects coming in and the skill sets and availability of current resources? That was all in a vacuum, and they wanted to get into a strategy in a position where they are not only able to predict the demand of resources and gauge the availability of resources accordingly, but then be able to also train resources and hire external resources if required in accordance as well. At the same time, set the expectations of the executive leadership on the possibilities of certain projects taking place or not. So let's say if the roadmap had 20 projects that needed to get done, but they only had resource capacity for 10, then that's a massive concern that needs to be addressed. So the decision is whether you hire for more or you literally just focus on 10 projects. That is the level that you wanted the organization to be at. And so building in this specific through this approach where we identified what the requirements for this tool are, validating it through a controlled and curated pilot, understanding what was truly needed to really make this tool a success, then implementing it and rolling out the strategy accordingly, we were able to get the organization's PMO to a point, I believe over a period of 6 to 12 months, to that ideal state that was required, right? And this involved not just the implementation and integration and configuration of the tool, but like I said, a whole process around how resource management will work, who were the key players going to be required, what are the data elements that are needed, how do we prepare that, there was in fact the creation of a central resource hub that really controlled all of this, and then the communication of this entire initiative to the executive leadership and how that was coming along, that was key as well. So yes, Cornelius, it can make a world of a difference in making sure that the tools can work along effectively. Another client that I worked with, the cycle and scope of all of this was much shorter. There were a couple of tools. It was a fast-moving organization and a small one too, about 150 resources or so. PMO was a one-man army, if you will, and he was responsible for setting up and rolling out the PMO and the appropriate tools associated with it. So we cut this process down into within literally a month. But again, it was a smaller organization, and we had a lot more flexibility around how we wanted to do things. So we did follow this entire process, but really focused on the fact that we needed to make sure that resource management was at play and that the fact that schedule management was at play. We understood which were the good tools out there that can help that. We did a pilot on one project to see how it works, and then we started rolling that out, right? So the bottom line here is that I portrayed to you two ends of the spectrum in terms of duration and intensity, but both were successful because they followed the same process. So here, the end goal is there. Let's not copy or mimic the end product, but rather emulate the process that was followed. And that can really help out an organization and a PMO getting and discovering the best tool for them.
Now, allow me to take a step back here for a little while. We haven't really mentioned any tools by names or by type, but when I follow our conversation, it seems that we're mostly talking about software tools, right? So a piece of software that gets installed to help the PMO to manage all its data.
Yes.
Are you also, or have you also implemented other types of tools like physical tools, process assets, in addition to the software?
So if you can maybe help explain that a bit further, Cornelius. I mean, we did talk about enablers, etc. as well, but did you have anything else in mind over there?
Yeah, so the tools that I have often seen in PMOs at its very basic is a project management methodology that is being used throughout, templates that are being used throughout. So even if you introduce a piece of software, the software may contain a certain set of templates, but you still have to work on those and improve them for your team so that the templates can then actually be used in the project processes.
Makes a lot of sense. Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of tools and templates out there. But again, for these non-software related tools, I would say that having tools and templates is also extremely key. And yes, I have seen them being used. I've had to create some of them from scratch. These tools and templates are usually used for reporting, for managing schedules, or even coming up with very basic and quick and dirty project portfolio prioritization. So for instance, Oftentimes I've created tools in Excel to help executives determine what projects they want to focus on and come up with a few criterias, give them a bit of a ranking, take out the average for those, and you have a project prioritization that's objective and not just based on someone's pet project or one person's forceful decision, but rather a consensus of leadership on what projects should take. So absolutely, those tools can also be extremely valuable because, like I mentioned earlier, they'll understand knowing, they provide support to the PMO in predicting and then making a decision. So absolutely, that's a great point, Cornelius.
To close most of our interviews here on the Project Management Podcast, I usually ask our guests to give us, a tip or two to help us apply what we have learned. But in your case, I'm actually going to ask you to give us 5 tips because that is, in fact, how you are closing your presentation. So thank you very much for making my life much easier. So in closing, we have 5 tips, and let's go through them here one by one. The first tip that you have is think big and start small.
Yes. So, when I talk about think big and start small here, I want to make sure that when PMO leaders are talking about and considering their PMO tool, think of the bigger vision. Think overall, how can it effectively meet the needs of the PMO? Don't go about implementing that big vision immediately. Start small. Start with a few chunks and then take it from there. That's the first tip for that.
Tip 2 is you need to have an engaged and vocal executive sponsorship.
Yes. Like any project, you need to make sure that you have people backing you up and that they are engaged and vocal about it as well. And if they're not, then as a PMO leader, it is your role to make sure that they do that. And there are many reasons behind it, right? There could be personality situations where people aren't, executives aren't that vocal or engaged. That's just their nature, where they go about trusting the execution and implementation of something on their team. Or it could be simply a fact that these sponsors aren't aware of what their roles should be, and they're not engaged because of that. Or because, like we've seen quite often, it could be a simple issue of prioritization. Your project needs to get the attention and engagement of your sponsor, and you need to make sure as a PMO leader that gets high on his or her priority.
Tip number 3, you have to have realistic adoption expectations.
Adoption is what makes or break any PMO tool. And I think this is where the maturity aspect comes in. If you have people who are, let's say if we're talking about software tools and, people aren't technologically savvy within your organization, then coming up with the best state-of-the-art shiny PMO tool is not really going to cut it. Having basic tools, even built within Microsoft Office or Google Docs, may cut it for you. If you have an organization that is, not very familiar or used to with, documented processes, then having processes that are, 5 layers deep is going to kill you because nobody's going to buy into those. Nobody's going to accept or work into them. If you have an organization which is not used to extensive documentation and you come up with a template that is 20 pages long, well, good luck for that getting used. That's not going to happen. So you have to understand what the organization can accept, can adopt, have realistic expectations around that, and build your tools around that and make sure that those are rolled out accordingly. And once they get through it, then you can bring in another layer of detail or maturity as you go along.
Tip number 4 is a single word: measure.
Yes. What you measure, that you only see progress in that. If you don't do any sort of measurement, you're not going to see any progress around that. So understanding what success looks like, what do you do to measure it, what metrics you use to measure, how you collect those metrics, how you communicate those metrics. that's what measure here really means. So from in terms of a PMO tools perspective, adoption could be one key metric that you could measure. The improvement in efficiency could be another metric that you could measure. Having great visibility into data. So for instance, if you were talking about resource management tool earlier, having great crystal clear insights into the availability and demand of resources, achieving that could be amazing. The influence of the tool. So it was used in one department, now it's used in 10 departments. That could be a measurement. So, those are the things that you need to think about in terms of what is the ultimate value that your PMO tool and the implementation of your PMO tool doing.
And the final tip number 5, the interim solution is interim.
Yes. So I've seen a few situations, Cornelius, where, we talked about the proof of concept and pilot right there, right? So people basically stopped at that phase and didn't move to the actual tool implementation and rollout. You do have an interim solution. Interim solutions are important because they're stop bridge gaps, but they are stop bridge gaps and they have certain constraints. In some cases, those proof of concepts that I talked about earlier, they do ultimately become into overall tool implementations, but their functionality and scope varies. And I think that is something that I would encourage all PMO leaders to do is whatever it becomes very easy for people and organizations to become complacent with what's going on, what's working, but you need to think about and foresee what are the challenges that you're going to face eventually when this runs out of time and start planning for that accordingly.
All right, to recap the 5 tips, they are think big, start small, have engaged and vocal executive sponsorship, have realistic adoption expectations, measure, and the interim solution is interim. Hussein, thank you so much for stopping by again here on the podcast and nudging us in the right direction to finding the best tools for our PMOs. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much once again, Cornelius. It's been a pleasure being on the podcast.
Hussein Bandokwala is a PMO coach. He helps aspiring and first-time PMO leaders succeed through coaching, webinars, workshops, and training. He is also a speaker, author, and LinkedIn Learning instructor. Find out more at parvascc.com and pmovirtualsummit.com. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Please visit pm-podcast.com for show notes, links, transcripts, and PDU information. Our email address is info@pm-podcast.com. And finally, we have this quote from Steve Jobs that fits today's interview perfectly. Technology is nothing. What's important is that you have faith in people, that they're basically good and smart, and if you give them the right tools, they'll do wonderful things with them. Until next time.